I want to analyze one of Russia's new weapons and the potential outcomes of global war. One of the key issues to note is the use of hypersonic weapons, specifically the Arctic missile that Russia has recently developed. This is a strategic weapon with extraordinary capabilities. This weapon cannot be intercepted by any missile defense systems the West currently possesses, making it unstoppable. The Arctic missile has been tested and is capable of striking with extreme heat upon impact. While we don't have full reports on its destructive capacity because the warheads used haven't fully demonstrated the weapon's true potential, its capability is frightening. What's crucial is that the Arctic missile isn't just about destruction, it's part of an escalation strategy that doesn't immediately lead to nuclear war, unlike other intermediate-range nuclear missiles of the past. This has put pressure on the US and NATO to develop countermeasures. One such proposal is the deployment of the US Dark Eagle missile next year in Germany. This would give the US the ability to strike the Russian capital in 7 minutes. That's a significant leap from older missiles like the Pershing II from the 1,980 seconds. We are heading into a very dangerous period where these weapons are becoming more easily usable, which brings us closer to the brink of nuclear escalation. Weapons like these are destabilizing, and unless we find ways to control or eliminate them, we are facing a future full of risks. On the nuclear arms front, we may witness another arms race similar to what happened in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. Back then, Russia deployed the SS-20 missiles, marking a significant shift from liquid fuel missiles to solid rocket motor missiles. This sparked a major standoff with the US, which responded by deploying Tomahawk and Pershing II missiles in Europe. This brought Europe to the edge of nuclear disaster. But fortunately, the leaders at the time signed the INF Treaty to eliminate these weapons. However, with Donald Trump pulling the US out of the INF Treaty in 2019, the situation has changed. We no longer have an agreement to regulate the development and deployment of intermediate-range missiles. This has given Russia the opportunity to develop and test new weapons, giving them an advantage over the US. In the current arms race, as for the situation in Ukraine, it's clear that ending the conflict will not be achieved solely through negotiations. Ukraine is unwilling to make the compromises necessary to reach a peaceful solution. They continue to claim they are winning and that they should dictate the terms of any peace settlement. The reality, however, is very different. Russia holds all the cards and is the one dictating the outcome. Russia has shown willingness to negotiate, but only if Ukraine accepts Russia's terms. Despite Western sanctions, Russia's economy is still functioning well. However, they are facing cash shortages because they don't print money like the US does. If this war continues past mid-2026, Russia may have to transition its economy to a wartime footing. This could involve significant sacrifices for the Russian people, but they are capable of making these sacrifices if necessary. If Ukraine does not agree to Russia's terms, the war will continue indefinitely, and Russia is fully prepared for that. Ukrainian forces are facing catastrophic losses on the battlefield. They have exhausted their manpower, equipment, and defensive positions. Their best brigades are surrounded and being annihilated. The equipment they do have is outdated and ill-suited for modern warfare, especially in the age of drones. Ukraine's forces are simply being slaughtered, and they have no hope of turning the tide of this war. In the face of this, the Ukrainian leadership continues to cling to fantasies of victory. The military has been decimated, and the remaining forces are ill-prepared for the realities of modern warfare. Ukraine is running out of both manpower and material support. Their best forces are encircled, and the country is rapidly approaching collapse. The Ukrainian government has no real bargaining power, and their future is bleak. The people of Ukraine will continue to suffer, and the country's infrastructure is being destroyed. The Russians are not going to let up the pressure. The Ukrainian military is now in full retreat, and unless they accept Russia's terms, they face complete annihilation. Ultimately, if Ukraine continues to fight, it will lead to the death of the nation. Ukrainian leaders must realize that their only option is to accept the conditions set by Russia, or their country will cease to exist. Time is running out. and Ukraine will not be able to hold on much longer. Russia is fully aware of the situation in Ukraine. They know the U.S. and European neocons like Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, and Tom Cotton want the war to continue. They believe they can bleed Russia dry, but Russia is unshaken by these efforts. Russia is fully confident that they will win this war, and they have made it clear to U.S. politicians like Rubio that their tactics won't work. Russia is prepared to face the West's provocations, but they will not back down. The U.S. and Europe are out of options, and their continued interference will only prolong Ukraine's inevitable collapse. Ukraine's leadership must decide, will they accept the terms for peace, or will they continue this suicidal path that will lead to the destruction of their nation? The situation surrounding the war in Ukraine remains dire, and the complex diplomatic process at play only adds to the confusion. There are reports of splits at the top of the Russian government regarding the handling of negotiations. Russian presidential advisor Ushakov recently stated that Russia might be able to work with the latest revised peace plan, though this is an extremely delicate situation. The tensions in the Russian government are evident, especially after Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, made an unusually harsh speech criticizing the way the peace process is being handled through back channels, bypassing his ministry entirely. This is a significant concern because Lavrov is the one who should be responsible for foreign diplomacy, but right now, that role is being undermined. The recent tensions surrounding Lavrov's remarks highlight the rift between the traditional diplomatic channels and the unorthodox back-channel approaches to negotiating with the U.S. Lavrov has expressed doubt over the peace process, calling out the use of back channels and emphasizing the importance of his ministry's involvement in any negotiations. The situation reflects not only a communication breakdown, but also a shift in power dynamics within the Russian government, with figures like Dmitry Karel, a Russian billionaire educated at Stanford, gaining prominence over more established diplomatic figures. The issue here is not just personalities, it's about who controls the direction of negotiations. Dmitry Karel is not a diplomat. Ushakov, on the other hand, has decades of experience, including a significant role as Russia's ambassador to Washington, making him far more suited for handling delicate diplomatic relations. However, it seems the control of the peace process is slipping away from him. One reason for this shift may stem from Donald Trump's mistrust of the traditional U.S. State Department, particularly the neoconservative elements that came into power under Dick Cheney. Trump has long been skeptical of the Department of State, and this mistrust has only deepened with the influence of figures like Marco Rubio. While Rubio is seen as a representative of the neocon camp, Trump's approach of involving individuals outside the traditional diplomatic circles, like his son-in-law Jared Kushner, reflects his strategy to bypass the usual bureaucratic channels. This is where things have gotten complicated and, to many observers, absurd. Foreign Minister Lavrov recently pointed out the problems with this kind of megaphone diplomacy and the leaked documents, which he described as part of a broader agenda to undermine the peace process. According to Lavrov, the leaked documents were meant to create hype and to derail any efforts that were being made to push for a peaceful resolution. He is right to be frustrated, as the entire process of diplomacy seems to be driven more by media leaks and political games than by genuine negotiations. Lavrov is well aware of the role that individuals like Steve Witko and Kushner are playing in these back-channel negotiations. While these figures are part of the ongoing peace efforts, Lavrov knows that they are not seasoned diplomats. These are business figures who have little understanding of the complexities of international relations and have no experience with the delicate art of peace negotiations. For Russia, this creates an additional layer of distrust and confusion, especially when someone like Lavrov, who has been a key player in Russian foreign policy for decades, is sidelined. Another glaring issue in this situation is the lack of professionalism in the 28-point peace plan that was leaked earlier. The document, which was allegedly created without input from the Russian Foreign Ministry, was so poorly drafted that it resembled something hastily scribbled on a cocktail napkin. It lacked any of the nuances or diplomatic considerations that would be expected from a peace plan. Instead, it seemed more like a hastily conceived political statement than a serious attempt to address the issues at hand. This failure to involve the proper channels like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has created a situation where even senior Russian diplomats like Lavrov are left in the dark about key aspects of the plan. In recent days, there have been indications that President Putin is increasingly at odds with his own diplomatic apparatus. This disconnect between Putin's high-level political agenda and the practical realities of international diplomacy has raised concerns that his strategy of engaging the West and seeking to establish better relations with the U.S. is failing. Lavrov's criticism of the peace process reflects a growing concern within the Russian government that Putin's emphasis on diplomacy with the West may ultimately backfire. Putin's willingness to engage with figures like Jared Kushner, a businessman with no diplomatic experience, speaks volumes about the direction Russia is heading. Kushner and his colleagues, though smart in their business dealings, are out of their depth in international diplomacy. The Russians know this. While these individuals may possess intelligence and business acumen, they lack the knowledge and expertise needed to navigate the intricacies of a peace process in a conflict as complex as the one in Ukraine. The Kremlin sees this, and it is clear that this approach is not working. In terms of what the Russians actually expect from these negotiations, it's clear that President Putin and his team are more focused on the battlefield than on back-channel diplomacy. While the U.S. and Europe may continue to push for peace through non-diplomatic channels, the Russians understand that any meaningful resolution will ultimately be determined by the outcome of military operations on the ground. As President Putin is quoted, "The only real deadline is when the war is over." The Russians are not likely to accept a peace plan that fails to address their core concerns, such as the territorial integrity of Russia and the safety of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. When it comes to the specifics of what a peace plan might entail, the reality is that there are several major issues that will make it difficult for both Russia and Ukraine to agree on any terms. The basic premise of the peace process is flawed, as it assumes that Russia is at a stalemate and that Ukraine has not been defeated. This is fundamentally inaccurate and undermines the entire negotiation process. Any peace plan based on this premise will be futile because it does not reflect the reality on the ground. In addition, there are ongoing concerns about the $185 billion worth of Russian assets that have been frozen by Western countries. Trump has suggested that these funds should be used for the reconstruction of Ukraine, but European leaders are opposed to this idea. They want to keep the funds frozen because they fear losing them in litigation. This is another example of the ongoing power struggle within the West, where European leaders are more interested in perpetuating the war for their own political gain than in finding a peaceful resolution. European leaders, such as Ursula von der Leyen, are not interested in peace. They are driven by the need to maintain their own power and to perpetuate the war. Von der Leyen's recent remarks about the peace process reveal her true intentions. She is more interested in expanding European influence than in stopping the conflict. Her comments about Ukraine's sovereignty and its future in the European Union are a thinly veiled attempt to prolong the war for her own political benefit. The European Union's true agenda is to continue the war indefinitely, regardless of the human cost. Ultimately, the question is whether President Putin will change his approach in response to the failures of the peace process. If the negotiations continue to falter, Russia may be forced to escalate its military actions and move towards a more decisive military victory. The peace process is unlikely to result in any meaningful agreement, and the longer it drags on, the more likely it becomes that Russia will achieve its goals on the battlefield. As for the denazification of Ukraine, the Kremlin has made it clear that this process will continue, but it is not about the physical elimination of Nazi elements. Instead, it is about changing the educational system and removing the Nazi propaganda that is being spread to the children of Ukraine. This ideological battle is a long-term process that will take time, but it is essential to the future of both Russia and Ukraine. Once the Nazi ideology is removed from the country's political culture and education system, Ukraine will be in a better position to build a stable and peaceful future. In conclusion, the situation in Ukraine remains complex, and while there are attempts at diplomacy, it is clear that Russia is focused on achieving its objectives through military means. The peace process, if it continues along the current trajectory, will likely fail, and the war will be decided on the battlefield. The key to resolving this conflict lies in recognizing the realities of the situation on the ground, and unfortunately, that means Ukraine is heading for a difficult and inevitable conclusion. The ongoing geopolitical struggle and the role of Russia in the conflict in Ukraine have reached a critical juncture. Recently, President Trump was asked by the media about the concessions Russia is making in the context of the peace talks. Trump succinctly responded that Russia's major concession is that they are willing to stop fighting and halt their territorial advances. This is an extraordinary concession on Russia's part. In any conflict, the act of halting military advancements, particularly when one side is gaining ground, is a monumental step that few governments are willing to take. The reality here is that Russia, despite significant military successes, is being asked to stop advancing, a move that could drastically change the trajectory of the war. This is particularly relevant as Russia continues its push through Donbass, which Trump now admits is likely to fall under Russian control in the coming weeks. The West, however, seems to be in denial, accusing Trump of conceding the Donbass without recognizing that the region's fate was already sealed long before any peace talks even started. Russia's military efforts in Donbass and beyond will continue regardless of Western opinions, and it's clear that Russia is gaining both strategically and territorially. Trump's 28-point peace plan, which is now being revised to 19 points, has been met with resistance from Ukrainian representatives. The revised plan, crafted by Ukraine's negotiators, has been rejected by Russia, signaling a major obstacle in peace efforts. The rejection is a clear message that Russia is unwilling to accept terms that do not align with its strategic goals in the region, especially when it comes to the status of territories like Donbass. Interestingly, there have been leaks, notably by Bloomberg, revealing details of conversations between key figures in the Russian and U.S. delegations. These leaks, while purportedly exposing Russia's influence over the peace plan, fail to recognize the full context. They aim to paint a narrative that Russia is manipulating the peace process, but the truth is, the 28-point plan, as it was originally written, is not a favorable deal for Russia. Why would Russia push for a peace plan that does not serve its interests? It doesn't make sense. The leak is an effort to discredit the plan and distract from the fact that the peace process is far from over. The leaked conversations between Ushakov and Witkoff show the behind-the-scenes strategizing, but there is nothing scandalous or revealing about them. These discussions highlight the ongoing communication between Russia and the U.S. in a chaotic and unconventional diplomatic process. What's clear is that the traditional diplomatic channels, especially those led by Lavrov, have been sidelined in favor of a more unorthodox approach. Whether this is a calculated move by the Russian government or a response to the dysfunctionality of the West is still uncertain, but it has undoubtedly complicated the negotiations. The Bloomberg leaks also reveal a more significant issue: Russia's continued military advantage. While European and U.S. officials push for a ceasefire, they are deeply concerned about the pace of Russia's military operations and its ability to continue indefinitely. U.S. Army Secretary Driscoll's admission that Russia can outproduce the U.S. in weapons and sustain its war effort indefinitely is an acknowledgement of the stark reality that the West is struggling to keep up with Russia's military capabilities. This revelation should serve as a wake-up call to the West, highlighting the limits of their ability to aid Ukraine and the inevitable success of Russia's military strategy. There is growing panic within Europe about the potential failure of the peace process. France, Britain, and other European powers are scrambling to figure out how to secure their own interests in the event of a deal. Macron and other European leaders are openly preparing for the possibility of deploying troops to Ukraine to guarantee security once a deal is reached. However, these proposals are merely a distraction from the real issue. Europe is increasingly sidelined in the broader negotiations, and their influence on the outcome of the conflict is waning. This is evident in the rift between European leaders and figures like Marco Rubio, who, despite his pro-European stance, continues to push for policies that align more with U.S. geopolitical interests. Rubio's reluctance to engage with European diplomats, including figures like Kakoulis, reveals a deeper issue within the Western alliance. The Europeans, particularly those in the EU, still operate under the illusion that they are on equal footing with the U.S., when, in reality, they are merely vassals in the broader geopolitical game. The situation is compounded by the growing discontent within Europe over the handling of Russia's frozen assets. Macron and other European leaders have strongly opposed Trump's plan to use these assets for Ukraine's reconstruction. They argue that the assets should remain under European control, which underscores the divide between European and U.S. priorities. This disagreement over the use of frozen Russian assets is just one of many signs that the EU is struggling to assert itself in the negotiations and is becoming increasingly irrelevant in the larger discussion about Ukraine's future. Macron's insistence that only the Europeans should control the Russian assets is a clear attempt to assert European authority in the face of growing U.S. influence. However, the reality is that Europe is in a weak position, unable to dictate the terms of the peace process or even manage its own financial interests in the wake of the conflict. The European Union, weakened by its economic struggles and internal divisions, is rapidly losing its ability to shape the course of events in Ukraine. On the ground, Ukraine continues to face an uphill battle. The Ukrainian military is running out of resources, and the U.S. defense industry is struggling to keep up with the demand for weapons and equipment. Driscoll's warning to Ukraine that they are facing imminent defeat is a stark reminder that Ukraine's military situation is deteriorating rapidly. The reality is that Russia can continue to fight indefinitely, and the West simply does not have the capacity to sustain Ukraine's war effort for much longer. In summary, the ongoing negotiations and the conflicting interests of the U.S., Europe, and Russia highlight the deep divisions within the West and the overwhelming advantage that Russia holds on the battlefield. The leaked documents and behind-the-scenes strategizing reveal the chaotic nature of these talks, but the ultimate outcome is clear. Russia is winning this war, and the West is struggling to keep up. The 28-point peace plan may have been an attempt to resolve the conflict, but the revisions and leaks only serve to show that any agreement that involves Russia's defeat is unrealistic. The only path forward is for Ukraine to accept Russia's terms or face continued military defeat. Europe, caught between the U.S. and Russia, is becoming increasingly irrelevant. And the sooner they acknowledge this reality, the better it will be for the stability of the region.